Lena had worked as a night nurse at Oak Ridge Hospice for over a decade. The job was emotionally draining, but she found purpose in comforting the dying during their final moments. However, one mystery haunted the staff: Bruno, the hospice's resident dog. Bruno was an old Labrador mix, gentle and quiet. He spent most of his time curled up in a corner of the common room, barely reacting to the bustling nurses or the occasional visitors. But what disturbed Lena, and many others, was his eerie ability to predict death. Bruno would only visit certain patients, those who had mere hours left. He would sit at the foot of their beds, refusing to leave, staring at them with solemn eyes. By the next morning, the patient would always be dead. At first, the staff dismissed it as coincidence. "He probably just senses when someone is weak," they would say. But it wasn't just the sickest patients. Sometimes, those who seemed stable, even improving, would suddenly pass away after Bruno's silent visit. The night that changed everything. One stormy evening, Leni was on duty, making her usual rounds when she noticed Bruno standing outside room 306, whimpering softly. That was strange. He had never hesitated before entering a room. Inside, an elderly woman named Margaret Hollis lay asleep. She had been admitted weeks ago with terminal heart failure, but she was surprisingly responsive earlier that day. The doctors believed she had a few more weeks, maybe even a month. Bruno scratched at the door, hesitant, and then he let out a deep guttural growl. Lana shivered. Bruno never growled. She slowly pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by the glow of the hallway, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Margaret lay still, her breathing slow and rhythmic. Everything seemed fine, but Bruno refused to enter. He stayed in the doorway, his body stiff, staring past Lena into the darkness. Then Margaret stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she mumbled something. Lena leaned closer. "Mrs. Hollis, are you all right?" Margaret's lips trembled. Her voice was barely a whisper. "He's here." Lena's breath caught in her throat. "Who's here?" Margaret's gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where nothing but shadows loomed. "The man in black, the one Bruno sees." Lena turned to look. There was nothing there, but Bruno's growls deepened. He backed away, tail tucked, his fur bristling as if something unseen had just moved past him. Margaret gripped Lena's wrist. Her frail fingers were cold, almost lifeless. "He's closer now. It won't be long." Lena felt the hairs on her neck stand up. "Who is closer, Mrs. Hollis?" Margaret's breathing hitched. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then her entire body jerked violently. A choking sound escaped her lips. Her eyes rolled back. The monitors beside her erupted in a frenzy of beeps. Lena jumped into action, pressing the emergency button, but deep inside, she already knew. Margaret was gone. The aftermath. The doctors ruled it as a sudden heart attack, a tragic but natural death. But Lena couldn't forget what she had seen. The way Margaret spoke of an invisible presence. The way Bruno had growled at the empty air, as if death itself had walked into that room. That night, as she walked past the common area, she saw Bruno curled up in his usual spot. But his eyes followed her, dark and knowing. For the first time, Lena wondered, was Bruno predicting death? Or was he warning them of something else? Something unseen? Something that came to take them away? And if so, why did he hesitate at Margaret's door? What had he seen that even he was afraid of? Daniel had always loved walking home at night. The silence, the cool air, the empty streets. It was his time to think, to clear his mind. But that night something felt Different. The air was thick, suffocating, as if unseen eyes watched his every move. That's when he noticed the dog. It stood at the end of the dimly lit street, a shaggy black mutt with glowing yellow eyes. Daniel frowned. He didn't remember seeing any strays around his neighborhood before. The dog didn't bark or growl. It just stared. He turned away and kept walking. A few minutes later, he glanced back. The dog was following him. His heart picked up speed. It wasn't unusual for strays to trail behind people, but this dog moved too quietly, its paws making no sound on the pavement. Daniel sped up. So did the dog. He turned a corner. So did the dog. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, too. The silent stalker. As he reached his apartment complex, Daniel exhaled in relief. He glanced behind him. One last time, the dog was gone. Shaking his head, he entered his building and locked the door behind him. Just a stray, he told himself. Nothing to be afraid of. That night, he had a dream. He was lying in bed, unable to move. A heavy weight pressed down on his chest. He opened his eyes to see the black dog sitting at the foot of his bed. Watching, its yellow eyes burned into him. It didn't move, didn't blink. Daniel tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then the dog whispered, not in barks, not in growls, but in a deep, rasping voice. It's coming. Daniel jolted awake, drenched in sweat. His room was empty, but the feeling of those eyes still lingered. 3. The omen. The next morning, Daniel tried to brush off the dream. It was just his imagination, right? Then his phone rang. It was his sister crying. Their father had died in his sleep. Daniel's blood ran cold. He remembered the dog, the way it had followed him, the way it had spoken in his dream. Was it just a coincidence? But that wasn't the end. A week later, he saw it again, standing outside his apartment, watching. And that night, he had another dream. This time, it whispered a different name. His mother's. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the black dog wasn't just a stray. Ever since the night it whispered his father's name in a dream, he had tried to ignore its presence. But how do you ignore something that follows you? Always watching, always waiting. The worst part, no one else could see it. One evening, Daniel sat in his living room, scrolling mindlessly through his phone, trying to distract himself. His mother was staying at his sister's house, devastated by their father's sudden death. He hadn't told her about the dog. Who would believe him? The apartment was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your skull, making your thoughts sound too loud. Then it happened again. A strange, heavy weight settled on the air. The temperature in the room dropped. Daniel's breath hitched as he turned his head toward the window. And there it was, the black dog, sitting in the middle of the street, staring straight up at his window. His throat went dry. His hands felt numb. He had locked his doors, closed all the windows, but still it had found him. A chill slithered down his spine as the dog tilted its head slightly. And then, its mouth moved. Daniel couldn't hear the words, but he knew. He just knew. Another whisper, another warning, and another death. 2. A desperate attempt to escape. Daniel felt the panic rise in his chest. He couldn't let this happen again. He had to stop it. Without thinking, he grabbed his car keys and bolted out of the apartment. If the dog was an omen of death, maybe, just maybe, he could outrun it. He drove aimlessly through the darkened streets, gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away. But deep down, he knew it was useless. You can't run from death. And then the headlights illuminated something ahead on the road. Daniel's heart stopped. The black dog, sitting in the middle of the empty highway, waiting. 3. The final warning. Daniel slammed on the brakes, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. The dog didn't move. It just watched. A horrible realization hit him. He had been running from something inevitable. His mother. She was next. Shaking, he pulled out his phone and called his sister. She picked up on the second ring. Daniel? His voice was barely above a whisper. Where's Mom? A pause. She's sleeping. Why? Daniel swallowed hard. Go check on her, right now. There was hesitation, then the muffled sound of footsteps, then a scream. Daniel's blood turned to ice. She's not breathing. Oh my God, Daniel. The phone slipped from his hand. He didn't need to hear more. He already knew. The dog had warned him, but it was already too late. The last encounter. A week later, Daniel stood in his mother's empty house, grief weighing him down. His father, his mother, both gone within days, and then he felt it, that heavy presence. Slowly, he turned. The black dog was sitting in the hallway, its yellow eyes glowing in the dim light. For the first time, Daniel didn't feel fear. He knelt down, staring into those ancient, knowing eyes. Why? His voice cracked. Why me? Why them? The dog simply blinked. Then it stood up and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Daniel never saw it again. But every time he closed his eyes, he heard the whisper, a name, a warning, and the promise of another death to come. After his mother's funeral, Daniel tried to move on. He left his old apartment, moved to a new city, started a new job, anything to escape the shadow of the black dog and the deaths it had foretold. For months nothing happened. No strange dreams, no eerie whispers, no glowing yellow eyes staring at him from the darkness. Maybe, just maybe, it was over. Or so he thought. One night, Daniel was out with some co-workers, laughing over drinks at a bar. For the first time in a long time, he felt normal. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. He wasn't consumed by fear. Then, as he stepped outside to catch his breath, his entire body froze. There it was, standing across the street, half hidden in the shadows, the black dog, watching, waiting. Daniel's stomach twisted into knots. He wanted to believe it was just another stray, that it was just a coincidence. But deep down he knew better. The moment their eyes met, a cold whisper curled around his ear like a breath of wind. A name. His best friend Mark. 2. A race against fate. Daniel didn't waste a second. He ran back inside the bar, his heart pounding against his ribs. Mark was still at the counter, laughing, completely unaware of what was coming. Daniel grabbed his arm. We have to go, now. Mark frowned. Dude, what's wrong? No time to explain, Daniel hissed, dragging him toward the exit. Just trust me. Mark, confused but concerned, followed without argument. The moment they stepped outside, Daniel's breath caught. The black dog was gone, but that didn't mean they were safe. 3. The warning. No one believed Mark thought Daniel was crazy. You're saying a dog told you I was going to die? He scoffed, shaking his head. You need some sleep, man. I know it sounds insane, Daniel said, running a hand through his hair. But I've seen it before. My father, my mother. The dog came before both of them died. I can't just ignore it. Mark sighed, clearly trying to stay patient. Look, I appreciate the concern, but I'm not about to drop dead just because some creepy stray... A loud crash interrupted him. Daniel's heart leaped into his throat. They turned just in time to see a massive truck speeding toward them. Daniel shoved Mark with all his strength, sending him tumbling onto the sidewalk. The truck missed him by inches. The driver slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. He crashed into a lamppost with a sickening crunch of metal. Everything went silent. Daniel could barely breathe. Mark, still sprawled on the pavement, stared at him with wide, horrified eyes. I would have. Yeah, Daniel whispered. You would have. 4. The final revelation. That night, Mark didn't argue anymore. He listened as Daniel told him everything. The dog, the whispers, the deaths. Mark was shaken but alive. So what now? He asked. Daniel didn't have an answer. The dog had never warned him early enough to save anyone before. This was new, maybe. Maybe he wasn't just cursed to witness death. Maybe he could prevent it. And just as that thought crossed his mind, he felt it. That heavy, suffocating presence. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. And there it was. The black dog. Still watching. Still waiting. But for the first time, Daniel wasn't afraid. Instead, he met its glowing yellow eyes and whispered, I understand now. The dog blinked. Then, without a sound, it disappeared into the night. Daniel exhaled. He didn't know when it would return, but when it did, he'd be ready.